Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Orphanlast, aka Skylar Madison, and welcome to the Teach Me to Draw series, where I go ahead and teach people who are either new to drawing or those of you that happen to have been drawing for a really long time and yet still haven't been able to reach that next level that you would like to reach in your artistic journey. Now, in this video, I'm going to be showing some copywritten characters. However, under Section 107 of the Copyright Act from 1976, allowances have been made for fair use purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Specifically, this video falls under the category of teaching. I am teaching here, so with that out of the way, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the video. So what normally gets a new artist starting to draw is their inspiration towards the things that they know, the things that interest them, which is the cartoons on the television. Now, if it happened to have been something more advanced than the selection that I got on the screen, something like Full Metal Alchemist, Death Note, things like that, just stay tuned, wait for me to get into the more advanced level of teaching, but still follow through with this if you're still struggling and you haven't reached that next level. And so I've gone ahead and gotten a little selection of variously different cartoon characters on the screen, some of them from Looney Tunes, Steven Universe, Chip and Dale, that was from my childhood, The Simpsons, and Powerpuff Girls, Family Guy, all that good stuff. Now, there are some cautionary tales here. There are some cartoons that you can draw from, however, they're not going to teach you anything. They're not going to make you learn anything about drawing or drawing better. So you have to be really careful about that. Specifically, it's the Powerpuff Girls, and it's also Steven Universe, to be honest. I will admit that Steven Universe is a little bit of a step up from the Powerpuff Girls, but really not very much. Ultimately, if you're going to be drawing from the Powerpuff Girls, you might as well be kind of drawing from South Park. There's not much of a difference from the two. These days, you look at the South Park episodes coming out nowadays, and really there's not much of a difference between the two. And I'm only saying that visually speaking, in terms of quality and craftsmanship with the images. I think that the main reason why the Powerpuff Girls are designed the way they are is because this was when cutout animation was starting to replace traditional animation on television, and it was all being done digitally, probably with Flash, and rather than using a stylus in order to draw out your characters, people were using what I guess is being called the pancake method, where your whole workflow can be done with just your mouse and the geometry tool if we're talking about if we were to animate inside of Open Toons. But even with a silly little sketch straight from the Powerpuff Girls, you can see that I put some thought into it, not a whole lot. I was able to dissect the construction of this character very easily without having to try to dissect some sort of workflow from the reference, which you'll see later on in the video. Now, the primary reason why I say you won't be able to learn very much from drawing from the Powerpuff Girls, it's basically the fact that they're flat. There's no three-dimensionality to their design or anything. Yes, there's a curved line here, a curved line there, but it's wrong. Not only that, but there's never any point in time when you're watching the Powerpuff Girls, there's no promotional images of the Powerpuff Girls where it's a profile view or a three-quarter view. Like, technically, this is the three-quarter view here that I'm drawing here, and it still looks like the character's looking pretty much just straight towards the camera. And that's the main reason why I don't like the Powerpuff Girls as a reference when you draw. But what can you learn from drawing from the Powerpuff Girls? That's the main thing here. And the main thing that you can learn from drawing from the Powerpuff Girls is this: as long as you're doing what I'm doing. You see, I lined out a sketch, and then I go ahead and I do the final draft over it, and I correct the mistakes of the sketch. Even if the sketch is really, really wrong in some areas or in a lot of different areas while I'm cleaning it up, drawing something when there is actually something there is a lot easier than drawing in an area where there's literally nothing, no guidelines, no preconceived notion of what might actually be there. I really hope that makes sense. It's really important to line out the variously different geometric shapes, or at least to kind of conceptualize the geometric shapes inside of a sketch before you go about lining out the final details. even if you're drawing from the Powerpuff Girls. Now, I honestly learned how to draw from drawing from comic books, something that's much more advanced than any of these cartoon characters. But the sad bit about that is I got used to learning human anatomy, a really formal way of drawing, whereas with a lot of the cartoons, you're typically drawing geometric shapes instead of lining out a skeleton for the sketch and then lining out the muscles and how everything is coming together and such like that in that sort of way. Instead, with a cartoon character, there's less of a skeletal structure and more of a series of geometric shapes, and that's it. So what I'm doing in this video right here, right now, this is not my strong suit. I'm not used to drawing out characters this way at all, not even a little bit. But the same fundamentals still apply. Even though I'm not drawing out realistic anatomy, even though I'm not drawing out a formal structure for the skeleton and such like that, I'm still drawing a sketch beforehand. But looking back on my workflow, while having drawn out all of this stuff, I think I actually would have benefited better if I personally, for me, had actually constructed a skeleton that would work for the strange anatomy that some of these characters happen to have. I wouldn't have struggled as much. But 90% of the cartoonists out there, when they're drawing an actual cartoon, they're thinking in geometric shapes, not in terms of figuring out the anatomy, because they're dumbing down the structure of the person to just a series of lines that can be drawn out as quickly as possible. Primarily because they're going to be drawing those lines millions of times, frame by frame. And that's why they're able to draw these characters really quickly. By the time that they've gone ahead and drawn the character out a couple hundred times, they've got it down. Now notice how I'm just going ahead and drawing on the actual reference image. This kind of helps me out in trying to figure out what the construction should be. And I've seen this in my childhood. Little drawing books for super cartoony looking characters. This is something that's pretty common for cartoonists to do. In fact, Preston Blair has a book all about animation, and he highly recommends this method when drawing out cartoon characters. Once I feel like I've got a good understanding of what makes this character who they are and how to draw them out, I go ahead and sketch him out. But you can actually kind of see my thought process as I'm going about drawing out this sketch and such. Now, you don't have to necessarily keep all of the guidelines on the screen at all times as you're sketching him out, but you need enough to actually know what you're doing. I just tend to have a little bit of a messy workflow. Eventually, you see me as the characters get more and more complex. I do wind up making things a little bit more cleaned up eventually at some point. And it's actually kind of surprising because some of these characters are deceptively difficult. It's strange to think that a character that's primarily composed of a series of really basic geometric shapes actually takes a lot of effort sometimes in order to bring them to life. But in the end, I feel like I got a close enough likeness to each of these characters. As for Steven Universe, there's not really much aesthetic appeal to him, at least where I'm concerned. I don't feel like there is. And there's really not too much to talk about with him. There is a sense of roundness to him. You do wind up seeing him from variously different angles. And that's something that I do appreciate about Steven Universe when contrasted and compared with South Park and the Powerpuff Girls. Now, if you ever sit down and draw from a reference image, like how I'm doing throughout this entire video, and you're struggling at a specific spot of the drawing because it just doesn't seem to look like your reference image, this is the reason why. It's because you're thinking in terms of symbols. You think you know what it looks like, but you're not spending the time to actually look at that specific area and actually ask yourself, what does that look like? Can I describe it in words? If you can't describe it in words, then maybe you just need to keep on experimenting, trying one failed experiment after another until you get it just right. Oftentimes, we as human beings, we just assume that we know what something looks like. We're thinking in terms of symbols, and we need to stop doing that, especially when you're drawing. Now, when you're drawing cartoon characters like these, in a way, these cartoon characters are just symbols. They're just a different type of symbol. So when drawing from a cartoon character that's as simple as these sorts of characters, you're kind of just replacing one symbol for another symbol. But I do actually think that when you're starting out to draw, just starting out, learning to study your reference with geometric shapes, learning to sketch the image completely out before you start trying to draw the final image is extremely important. And in my opinion, the best way to wind up with a final image that renders the most emotional reward when starting out is when you're drawing from cartoon characters that are as basic as these. Now, Tweety Bird was actually really quite deceptively difficult to draw. It's something about the spacing of the eyes in between each other. I never got that quite right, I think. I did a lot of experimentation with it, and yet again, it's surprising how just a character that's composed of just a few geometric shapes is really difficult to bring to life. Something to just keep in mind. You can even see me in this video struggling to get the character just right. And the only reason why I was able to get as much of a good image as I wound up having in the end was because I wound up drawing out the sketch. And you even just saw me get frustrated with a sketch and then start completely over. And even this sketch was fundamentally flawed on many different levels. And so you actually will watch me pull out the lasso tool and just transform the dimensions of the character so that he resembles the anatomy or even the pose, the gesture and everything of the original. Now, in my opinion, it's okay if your gesture, the pose that you put the character in, is different from your reference image. I don't have any problem with that most of the time. Because normally when I'm drawing from a reference, I'm usually actually drawing from either life or something that's much more complicated than this. And exaggeration is usually something that's applauded when you are drawing from a reference, because that's something that also brings a character to life. The difference from your drawing from your reference is oftentimes a form of exaggeration of the pose and such. But I didn't really feel like it was in the case of any of these. Again, drawing cartoon characters with just geometric shapes and just geometric shapes alone, and not refining those geometric shapes into bones and kind of a general idea of various muscle structures, this is not my strong suit at all. It's kind of ironic. I can draw something that's fairly complex, but once it comes to drawing out a character that lacks realism, that is where I struggle. It's bizarre. Now, sometimes it takes a day or 2 days for you to see what's wrong with your drawing when compared to the reference image. For example, at this moment right now, after having waited a few hours after having drawn this image and looking at it right now on the screen, I can see that Tweety Bird's cheeks come to a narrower region than what I actually drew out. Now, I love drawing digitally because it allows me to be able to adjust things without necessarily having to completely redraw them all over again. So I could just go ahead and go into a different persona inside of Affinity Photo and quickly make that change. But if this were pencil and paper, that would be a much more difficult process to go through. Now, the main takeaway here that I want to really emphasize is basically what the last video was talking about. The last video in this series was titled The Importance of a Sketch. And you can really see I am trying to backwards engineer what the sketch is for this cartoon character before I even start sketching. If I was drawing on pencil and paper, I would have the original reference image and a photocopied version of the reference image. And with that photocopy, I would go ahead and draw out my hypothesis on what the construction for this character should be. What's going to help me draw this character. Now, I could go online and try to see how the actual official artists drew out these characters, but that's not going to help me 100%. I need to know how I draw these characters. How can I personally decipher the shapes and everything like that? The weird thing about Homer Simpson is I never noticed that his mouth was more so on the lower end of his weird brown ape mouth area. If you were to separate his mouth area into thirds, it's on the lower third of the mouth. And so it's little subtle details like that you need to notice. How narrow are Tweety Bird's cheeks, even though I failed to realize that? Where is the placement of the mouth in relationship to the brown weird mouth ape area on Homer Simpson's face? Those sorts of things. So when I drew out the original sketch, that didn't really seem to match up. And so that's some of what I had to work out with, the lasso tool and such like that. If I was working with pencil and paper, I would have had to draw out all of that all over again. But I was pretty happy with how things were turning out. Really, there wasn't too much of a struggle to get a good likeness of Homer Simpson. But there are a few things that were a little off. But then again, this is kind of a viral image of Homer Simpson where he kind of walks backward and disappears into some bushes and looks all cross-eyed and such. Now, throughout this entire video, I've been trying to go from the easiest drawing to progressively getting more and more difficult. And so the next image that I decided to tackle was Peter Griffin. The construction seemed to me as though his head was just a big circle with a notch cut out of it. That circle goes straight down into being a neck, and then his body's a big circle, and then his arms are just sausage-looking objects. And yeah, he's deceptively difficult to draw. I think in the end I got a little bit of a likeness. I don't think that I actually got the proportions of Peter Griffin down correctly in the sense that things weren't measuring out properly. And so I wound up eventually needing to use the lasso tool and transform him down a little bit more, and that wound up kind of squishing his entire body in from being circles to being ovals. And so the sketch wasn't too accurate. But like I said earlier in the video, at least having something there when you're ready to start cleaning up the image, at least having something there is easier than having just a blank piece of paper there. You at least have somewhat of an idea of what needs to be there, and being able to contrast and compare where is my sketch wrong, and then looking at your reference image, that does wonders. Being able to try to experiment based off of what's in your current existing sketch versus what you're currently drawing, this is really helpful. Now, when drawing out a sketch on pencil and paper, make sure that you're drawing really, really lightly. There are occasions where you're drawing so lightly that by the time that you actually darken up the image and start doing your final cleanup work, those darker lines with your cleanup work are going to be so strong that no one's going to really be able to see, in contrast, any of your sketch lines. So sometimes you won't even necessarily need to pull out an eraser and delicately cut out all of your sketch lines if you're drawing on pencil and paper. So I see a lot of beginner artists when they're drawing with pencil and paper, they're pressing too hard on their pencil, and so it makes it nearly impossible for them to erase and correct mistakes, and so everything that they draw winds up being the final result, the final image. It's a lot easier to draw things from your imagination, but unless you actually draw from something, you're not going to expand your visual library, is what a lot of people call it. You're not going to be able to change your perception of symbols to actually being representative of an actual three-dimensional object. Keep in mind that when you're looking at, say, someone's ear, for example, from the back of their head, it's a completely different shape from when you're looking straight on towards that ear. And if you're looking at the person from straight ahead, that ear is going to look completely different from each of those angles. And so it's important that people actually realize that having a visual library is more than just figuring out where the lines go. There's a lot of beginners, when they start out drawing, they want to know the symbol. what is the symbol for how to draw an arm, and they learn where the placement of the lines are for a specific pose, and then they try drawing that arm in a different pose, and then the arm looks like it's broken. It's because they're not thinking in 3 dimensions. They're not thinking, okay, well, if I'm looking at someone's ear from the back of their head, it's going to be a different shape from looking at it straight on to looking at it from the front of their face. They're not thinking in those sorts of terms. And so those are all stumbling blocks that I see a lot of beginner artists experiencing. Now, I'm going to be going further in depth with describing that later on in the series, trying to describe what I mean by people thinking in symbols, trying to describe what I mean by thinking in 3D, trying to define that better for you. But for right now, I want you to just see what it is that I'm drawing, the different steps that I'm taking in order to prepare myself in drawing from a reference image, and then what I do in order to prepare myself to come up with the finished image. The last image that I wound up working on was, I believe it's Chip. I was always confused as to which one was Chip and which one was Dale. But regardless, early on in the sketching process, I wound up making him look quite a bit like the mascot for Nesquik, I believe. And then later on, I think the final image wound up looking more like the squirrel version of Balto more than anything, if you guys can recall that 1990s movie. Even though I'm not happy with how some of these turned out, at least not 100%, I'm happy enough to actually just, show you guys the final result of what I drew. But even though I'm not 100% happy with how some of these images came out, I'm showing you guys this sort of thing because even the more experienced artists always have images that they are proud of and images that they aren't proud of. There's always something about an image that could be better or something that they can improve on. For me, it's making cartoon characters. It's not like there's ever any point in time where all of the difficulty and all of the frustration just disappears. You're never happy with where you are as an artist. And so it's something that you're constantly working at. I am much more familiar with drawing something that looks more like a comic book or drawing from life. And so when drawing from a cartoon character, it's expected that I'm going to have a lot of difficulty with making the cartoon character actually look cartoony. So this was a fun exercise for me. This was something worth doing for me. It's something that I've been needing to do for myself in order to try to dissect how to draw a cartoon character. But this is actually where a lot of artists, when they're starting out, turn towards the cartoons because they seem like they're easier. And in a lot of ways they are. But just be aware that some of the life that you see in the cartoon characters on the screen are deceptively difficult. And you're not going to be learning how to draw from a cartoon character. When you're drawing from a cartoon character as a reference image, you're going to be learning how to dissect the sketch from the reference. You're going to learn to actually draw the sketch independently and how to look at the reference and imitate it. Because ultimately, you're just learning how to replace one symbol for another symbol. But learning as much as you can about how to properly dissect a reference image by thinking of how it can be sketched into basic shapes and how to independently create your own sketch in order to come out with the same image, that is an exercise worth doing for beginners and for those of you that have never reached the next level in your artwork. And that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe. If you guys would like to get more notifications from me, feel free to click on the bell or go ahead and follow me on Twitter. And if you guys would like to see more of my content, feel free to click on anything that's appearing on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your time.